was so striking is the resilience, or you might say the resistance of the monetary authorities, people like Bernanke, to respond to what was going on. So you would have thought, after it was clear that there was a bubble, that their belief that the bubbles didn't exist would have been undermined, and their belief in the models that bubbles could exist would be undermined. But it didn't. It hardly affected their belief in the underlying models. So that even after the bubble burst, they claimed that the effects were contained. And the reason was their models told them it was contained. I can't underemphasize the importance of models in helping shape the thinking that was going on. Their models said that there have been diversification. Their model said that in an economy, in a global economy with a total wealth of, say, $120 trillion, that the loss of a little housing wealth in the United States of a few $trillion was a perturbation that the system could easily absorb. So they believed that diversification had occurred, that the diversification had spread the risks, in effect dissipating them. And of course, again, the model proved wrong. And then the model has continued to fail us. The responses to the crisis, based on the advice from the same economists who helped create the circumstances of the crisis, have clearly been adequate. We're now more than 5 years since the breaking of the bubble, and the economy in the United States is not back to full employment. Economy in Italy is not yet even recovered to the level that it was before the crisis. And several countries in Europe are in depression. So what is clear is that the models that have been employed have not been adequate to the task. And then if you go back to the one part of the system that was, one could think of as at the origins, not the full cause, but origins, which is the private mortgage market. The private mortgage market is still sick. And government is, in the United States, is financing somewhat in excess of 90% of all mortgages. So here we have a free market economy, and one of the most important markets is still in the intensive care unit. Well, to me, many of the long-standing premises of the standard economics models have been called into question, and I've listed on the slide a whole set of them. I'm not going to go through them, but I'm going to highlight a couple of them. Though, is that one very strong assumption was that economic participants were fully rational, and they all, the essential part is they were solving these very complicated intertemporal maximization problems. Going on into infinitely far into the future, they couldn't solve a 2-period problem, let alone an infinite period problem. They assumed that firms are profit or value maximizing, and they knew how to manage risk. I don't know how many of you followed Greenspans' testimony to Congress after the crisis, and he said there was a flaw in his reasoning. A little flaw that cost the economy a few $1 trillion, let's put that aside. There was a flaw in his reasoning that he had assumed the firms would manage their risk better. After all, he assumed they were rational, profit maximizing, and value maximizing, and as part of that, you would manage risk well. Well, actually, I was surprised that he was surprised. Because the one thing that economists sort of agree on, not completely, but is that incentives matter. And anybody who looked at the incentives of the bankers knew that they had incentives to engage in excessive risk-taking. Now, there is a question, why did they have those perverse incentives? But that all has to do with the fact that these firms are not, in general, value or profit maximizing. There are perverse incentives having to do with problems of corporate governance. They assumed that markets were efficient and self-correcting, And there's a wealth of evidence that markets are not, in general, firms are not efficient, and certainly, given the history of economic fluctuation, they're not self-correcting. Getting evidence that markets are not efficient is hard because it's very difficult for us to assess the opportunity sets of firms and what they could or should have done. You can always suspect something was not efficient if a company like General Motors invests $100 billion and winds up with a firm worth $20 billion. But it could have been a rational mistake. You can't be sure. But one of the aspects where we do know, we understand the technology, is the technology of taxation. And if we look at what firms do with respect to taxes, we realize, fortunately, that many firms pay tens of billions of dollars more than they have to. Many other firms, let me emphasize, pay hundreds of billions of dollars less than they should. But that's a different question. That's called tax evasion. But what is remarkable is the extent to which they don't take advantage of the legal mechanisms they have for avoidance of taxes. Finally, the standard paradigm, the standard model that is taught in most universities basically assumes that institutions are irrelevant and that distribution is irrelevant. The standard model, slightly more complicated in recent years, but basically the standard model assumes that everybody's identical. And that's actually a remarkable assumption because, for me, much of my theoretical work was based on assumptions of asymmetric information, and the role of information asymmetries play in affecting the behavior of the economy. Well, the one problem is that if you have a representative agent model, a single individual in the economy, the only way you can get information asymmetries is with acute schizophrenia. And it's hard to reconcile the assumption of acute schizophrenia with rationality, which is the first assumption that they begin with. But there's some other problems as well. Hard to have a good financial market when there's only one person. Who is lending to whom? And even if you had a credit market where you're lending to yourself, a little peculiar, there's no problem of default because it would be like the left pocket not paying the right pocket. So all the interesting issues of financial markets really disappear in the representative agent model, where we're concerned about who's creditworthy, who won't pay, bankruptcy, all those kinds of issues. All the issues of financial interlinkages, how one bank's going down, brought down other banks. All of those issues were not addressed at all in the models. They were just assumed away. So in a way, one of the remarkable things about the crisis was that everything interesting that happened in the crisis was outside of the model. So it wasn't just that the model didn't forecast what happened, the model didn't address in any way what was going on. Well, it's hard to reconcile much of the observed behavior with the hypotheses that I've just described. Most importantly, I'm going to talk a lot about a number of the irrationalities that were observed. One of the complexities that I'll maybe have time to comment on is that there were some rational people that were exploiting other people's irrationalities. But a model based on all people being irrational just cannot explain what was going on. Well, with the private return, the crisis has also exposed a number of the other deficiencies in the standard models, particularly in macroeconomics. I was mentioning before, very briefly, the fact that it ignored distribution. One of the things it's a subject that I've been writing about a lot recently, and one of the implications, and if we have time, I'll come back to it, is that in my book, The Price of Inequality, one of the points that I try to raise is that, in fact, the distribution of income has profound effects on how the economy behaves, and that economies with more inequality behave in a more unstable way, and are in general more inefficient. They don't grow as well. And well, when I first enunciate some of these ideas, they sounded rather radical. The good news is that the IMF, even the IMF, I should say, now agrees, and they've come out with a number of research papers showing that there is a systematic relationship between inequality and instability. So that it is important in economists' models for thinking about how the economy functions to take into account the distribution of income inequality. Another very basic idea related to inequality that has underlaid economics for 150 years is a theory called the marginal productivity theory. The question is, how do we explain inequality? There was a big debate in the 19th century between Marxists who said it was power and the neoclassical economists that said, no, it's nothing to do with power. It's just the reason that people are at the top getting a higher income is that they're more productive. And society rewards people according to their productivity. So this theory called the marginal productivity theory was enormously influential. And in a way, the crisis, everybody had, a lot of people were big suspicious of that theory, particularly as, in general, executive pay increased out of proportion to performance. But I think the telling moment was in the crisis where so many of the bankers walked off with such huge bonuses, including bankers who had brought their company and the global economy to the brink of ruin. So how could you say they were walking away with multi-million-dollar bonuses, and you could say their social return, their private return to their company was negative? You know, some of you are mathematicians, you know, you could say maybe they made a sign error and assigning the bonuses, but that wasn't clearly what was going on. It wasn't a sign error. It was clearly there was a total disconnect between private rewards and social returns. Now, for a few of the banks, it was so embarrassing that they decided not to call it a performance bonus. They said, you know, how could we call it a performance bonus? So they decided to change the name, not to change the pay, but to change the name to a retention bonus. But it was equally puzzling. Why would you want to retain on your firm a guy who had brought you, and it was mostly guys, who had brought you to the brink of ruin? Well, one more thing that is particularly relevant to some of the things going on in Europe, the standard theory also says that there is a competitive full employment equilibrium in an economy, that if there's more debt, debt only affects the distribution of income. Debt only affects claims on resources. It doesn't affect the economy's potential for production. So for Italy, that's good news. With its debt GDP ratio of 120%, that has distribution consequences. But there is absolutely no reason why Italy today should not be at full employment. And yet we see country after country, and we see some economists, other universities, who say, oh, the debt is what's keeping the country down. That, as I say, there's no theoretical reason why that should be true. Debt is just a set of claims. Somebody owes money to somebody else. It is who gets the resources, not why the economy should not be working at full employment. To put it another way, The resources in Italy and the United States and other countries today are basically the same as they were before the crisis. We have the same human resources, physical resources, natural resources, but something isn't working well. We are operating significantly below potential output. And our standard models really don't have a very good explanation for why that is the case. And unfortunately, some policymakers are taking, I think, decisions that are leading to that gap be increasing and persisting. Well, this is a lecture in memory of Herbert Simon, and he called attention to many of the flaws in the standard theory. I think his work was really outstanding. He understood that individuals are not always fully rational. There were bounded rationality. He also understood that organizations do not behave like a single individual, and that we needed to study how organizations behave and how organizational designs affect behavior. In any organization, it's a group of people, there's a collective action problem. And how does that collective make those decisions? Interesting thing was that most of you know Ken Arrow's famous book, Collective Action and Social Choice. His research actually began by studying firms. That was the context in which he originally began to do his work. And it was, how does a firm make decisions? Well, since the work of Simon, there has been enormous work on one particular set of problems arising out of organizations, what's called the problem of agency, related to the problem of corporate governance, that can be related to problems of imperfect information. Well, there have been a lot of changes in the economic profession since Simon. Partly, I think he helped move the economics profession along in the right way. There is, for instance, been the recognition of the importance of imperfect, costly, and asymmetric information, which explains the necessity of delegation. It helps us understand the consequences of agency. But there have also been important developments in behavioral economics, which have explained that that the model of the rational individual, which has been at the center of macroeconomic models, is just wrong. That individuals are, as one person put it, predictably irrational. Their behavior is predictable, but not consistent with the standard rational model. So a lot of this work has incorporated insights from psychology, and that's become much more accepted today in the economics profession than it was when he was writing. There's the beginning of an understanding of the social organizations, thinking of a firm as a social organization, but a society more broadly as a social organization. But this work is in a far less developed state. One of the aspects of that, there's been a long history of difference between psychology and sociology. Psychology talks about sort of innate preferences, just that the way the mind is wired is different the way that the economists assume that it's wired. Sociology emphasizes that our preferences, our behavior, our perceptions are to a large extent socially determined. That is to say that other people's judgments, perceptions, affect our judgments. I mean, even the language we use, the categories that we use are socially determined. And the way societies do answer those questions is very markedly different across different societies. And if that's the case, of course, that means that we ought to be thinking about those social interactions a lot more than we have. So I'm going to come to that at the end of the talk. I can't help but spend just a second on talking about some of the flaws in the basic mathematical modeling. Because one of the ironies is that the standard macro model called the DSGE model, those standard models The pride was that they were rigorous, mathematically sophisticated. It was all about the mathematics. It wasn't about the economics, because if they thought about the economics, they would have realized how bad they were. So it was really driven by a belief that there was really some interesting mathematics here, and that it was a way you could show your mathematical prowess by solving these very complicated dynamic programming, intertemporal maximization problems, and it was a way of getting tenure. What I want to just emphasize is that even the mathematical formulations had embedded in them very strong assumptions which contributed to the wrong conclusions. And the particular assumption is one that's been very strong in economics for a very long time, assumptions about convexity, diminishing returns. The assumption of convexity, of diminishing returns, underlies the notion that diversification spreads risk and leads to a more stable economic system. But when you think about it, and when policymakers thought about it, they really again had a kind of schizophrenia. Before the crisis, they always talked about diversification, the advantages of spreading risk around. It divides the risk and makes it smaller. But after the crisis, what was the word that they used? And they still use in Europe. They used the word contagion. Now, if you think of interrelations as being contagion, think of that as a metaphor. Contagion, it's a term borrowed from contagious diseases. Those of you, most of you probably haven't studied the mathematics or of contagious disease, but the intuition is fairly clear. How do we respond to contagious diseases? Let's say we have a group of people with all of whom have a contagious disease. If we use the mathematics of the standard macroeconomic models based on diversification, what would you do? You send them all over the world because we want to spread the disease. We want to diversify the disease around the world. Now, obviously, that's not what we do. What do? We isolate, we quarantine. We believe that interdependence is bad. So the macroeconomic profession had this two sets of mindsets. Before the crisis, they talked about the advantages of interdependence, interlinking. After the crisis, they talked about the disadvantages. But they didn't have a single model that integrated the two. They were able to believe all the time that in the first stage, they would stop the crisis so they would never have to deal with the second stage. But they never, ever succeeded in stopping the crises. So they never had a coherent approach. Well, the example I just gave really highlights the general mathematics. Whenever there are non-convexities, interdependence can lead to greater risk. And there's a very general theorem that I proved that in general, as I say, it is not optimal diversified risk. And that there's an optimal degree of diversification. This is important because non-convexities are rife, our economy is rife with these non-convexities. And if that's true, we have to worry about not only banks that are too big to fail, which is what a lot of the recent policy discourse, that you have banks that are too big to fail, that means they take under too much risk, and that makes this system riskier. But we also have a problem of banks that are too interlinked to fail. And we should have known about that because that's exactly what happened in 2008. And the interesting thing is there were a couple models written before 2008 pointing this out. Bruce Greenwell and I had a paper, and Allen and Gale had a paper, both pointing out that you could have what we call bankruptcy cascades. It's even worse than that because banks have an incentives to become too interdependent, too interlinked to fail. So we haven't solved the problem of too big to fail. We haven't even begun to discuss the problem of too interlinked to fail. Well, this lecture, and I'm going very slowly, I'm afraid. This was all the beginning. Focuses on those flaws that are related to rationality and rational expectations, assumptions that, as I say, have been basically rejected by historical evidence and a lot of modern theory. I want to say that many of the problems with the standard model have long been noted. For instance, Bruce Greenwald and I pointed out that dropping the assumption of perfect information destroys all the classical theorems, including the theorem about markets being efficient. And what we showed was that even a small amount of information perfection can give rise to large amounts of imperfections of competition, large amounts of monopoly power. We showed that financial markets cannot be fully efficient, counter to the assumption that was a really prevailing doctrine that financial markets were efficient. In fact, what we showed is that if they were fully efficient, nobody would gather any information, which would mean that they wouldn't be efficient. So that just from a logical point of view, there's some deep logical flaws. But the interesting thing I want to emphasize is that even after we explored all the consequences of imperfect and asymmetric information, there were many, many aspects of market behavior that could not be explained. And that, what I want to emphasize is, obviously I want to say how important imperfections and asymmetries of information are, but it only goes so far, and that we have to go beyond that. And that's why I think there's some recent work focusing on bounded rationality, how organizations behave, is absolutely essential. As I say, there have been repeated crises. The only reason this got as much attention as it did is because people in America and Europe ignored, for the most part, what had happened in East Asia and Latin America and all the other countries. In fact, since we began the deregulation movement under Thatcher and Reagan in 1980, there have been over 100 crises. It's actually more unusual for a country not to have a crisis than have a crisis. Even the United States had a S&L crisis in 1989. But these were viewed as small things, costing a few $100 billion in 1989 money. It's a lot more in today's money. These have been really a continuing aspect of the market economy. And if you go back several hundred years, there's only been basically a 30, 40-year period in which we did not have financial crises, credit bubbles, credit booms, real estate bubbles, and that was in the period of Glass-Steagall, when we had strong financial bank regulation in the United States. If you look at credit booms and busts historically, I believe they're largely based on irrationalities. There's a little work showing that they could have been based on, there could be bubbles based on rational expectations, but they don't describe the bubbles we've actually had. What I want to point out is that these were not just theoretical niceties. The quantitative importance should have been evident, and obviously since the crisis has been evident. And in spite of that, they pursued a deregulation agenda with, I want to emphasize, a very large hidden distributive consequence. And this is important. People talk about we have to deregulate because if we don't, it gives rise to rent seeking. But what they didn't realize is the deregulation agenda was a rent-seeking agenda. It was an agenda for those in the financial markets to get rents from other people by engaging in exploitive predatory lending, abusive credit card practices, all kinds of market manipulation, a whole set of activities at which they had developed considerable expertise. If you look at the legal structure, hidden in the legal structure, there are lots of strong distributive implications. Take the bankruptcy law, which I think is one of the most outrageous things. The bankruptcy law, which says who gets first claim when you go into can't pay what you owe, the American bankruptcy law gives first claim to derivatives. Remember those things that brought down AIG and we had to pay a bailout of $180 billion. On the other hand, in our bankruptcy law, student debt can't be discharged under almost any condition. So that bankruptcy law really was a law that was about distribution and with very severe economic consequences. Well, I got carried away at this point, I have to say, because the next about 20 or 30 slides are about examples of irrationality. And I started thinking, and there were just so many of them, and I couldn't stop myself. I really don't know where to begin, and since you can't be here all night, you just have to trust me that they're just a huge number, and I'll just highlight a couple of them. The mortgage market, what was going on in the mortgage market was a good example. A lot of people were investing on the mortgage market on the belief that prices were going to go up, and lenders were lending in the mortgage market on the hypothesis that prices were going to continue to go up. And if you looked at the curve, they were going up very rapidly. But it wouldn't take very much extrapolation to realize, there's a couple very elementary laws in economics. One of them is you can't spend more than 100% of your income on housing. You don't have to have a PhD to figure that out, I hope. Well, where that was going, unless interest rates turned down to zero, you saw where that was going, that could not continue. But if the rate of increase in housing prices stopped, then housing would be less attractive. And once housing became less attractive, what would happen to housing prices? What happens when every bubble breaks? People don't want it. The reason they wanted a house was because, the reason why people were buying houses in the middle of the desert in Nevada was not because they wanted to live and get roasted. The reason they were there is they thought that it was going to go up in price. And the moment it stopped going up in price, they wanted to get rid of it, and the price fell. And as I say, you didn't have to be, again, a genius. The price of land in the desert is close to zero. If you go out to Nevada, you can see an infinite plain of worthless land. So what's the cost of a house? What should be the cost of a house? It's the cost of construction. And if the price goes much above the cost of construction, since the value of land is intrinsically zero, you know you've been had. And you know it can't continue. And yet, the price went well above the cost of replacement. Well, like every bubble, including the tulip bubble, that bubble broke. But you cannot explain what was going on in any model which assumes that most people were rational. The form of the mortgage in the United States also was very peculiar and led to hard to understand what was going on. In America, in many states, most states, you had non-recourse mortgages. Non-recourse mortgage means that individuals have an incentive, if they have a non-recourse mortgage, to take out a mortgage, because a mortgage is an option. If the price goes up, I keep it. If the price goes down, I turn over the key to the bank. And yet, banks were making mortgages at close to 100% of the value, non-recourse mortgages. Now, that was giving homeowners, those particular homeowners, an option of considerable worth. Now, you would say, the one thing I can assure you that the bankers I know are not in the business of giving money to poor people that they don't know. They're in the business of giving money to rich people that they do know, but not poor people. And yet they signed these mortgages and then had to live with the consequences. Now, the irrationalities that you see in the market were pervasive. It's not just people at the bottom or even ordinary bankers, all the way to the top. Talk about Greenspan. I've mentioned him before that I thought that his analysis, his ability to ignore the incentive structures facing bankers that would lead them to have an incentive for excessive risk-taking is an example of irrationality. But let me give you another example. He gave some advice to homeowners that they should take out a variable rate mortgage. He was cautious, like all central bankers. They hem and haw, but if you read, it was very clear that that's what he was saying. What was the argument he gave? The argument he gave was, if they had taken out a mortgage, a variable rate mortgage, say 10 years earlier, they would have done a lot better. And he was right. But why was he right? Why was it better to take out a variable rate mortgage 10 years earlier? Well, the general assumption of rational markets, of which he was a devotee, was that the long-term interest rate of a long-term mortgage is equal to, on average, the expected value of the short rates. That's what you mean by efficient markets in this context. If that's the case, what he should have advised them is to say, look, at what you will pay on average is exactly the same. Don't try to outguess what the Fed is going to do. On average, the guys who can know how to manage risk are much better than you. What kind of mortgage is better for your managing your risk? Because the market is very good at managing risk. You can't outsmart the market. Don't pretend that you can. And the answer to that is very clear. A fixed rate mortgage is much better because a variable rate mortgage, one day you may have to pay a mortgage interest payment of $500 a month, and the next day you may have to pay $5,000 a month. And most people can't manage that volatility. So for risk management, which he should have been advising, a fixed rate mortgage is a lot better. And people who had fixed rate mortgages did a lot better throughout the crisis. Well, why did, in that particular episode that he was referring to, did those with variable rate mortgages do better? Well, the reason is the market had never seen an episode where interest rates went down in the way that they did. And why did they go down? Because of Greenspan. He brought the interest rates down. So obviously, if interest rates have never been at 1%, the market could not have anticipated the interest rates going down to 1%. And those who foolishly, who took that gamble, won. But when interest rates are at 1%, what is the likelihood that they're going to be sometime in the future? You're not going to get interest rates going down probably to minus 5%. They're probably going to go up. And if that's the case, you're going to be in difficult financial straits. So here you had the person at the top of the Federal Reserve giving advice to people about risk management that was clearly irrational. The securitization market was pervasive irrationality, embodied in models that were used by the rating agencies, but believed by a lot of other people. Now, I'm not going to go into the extent to which the rating agencies were corrupt, affected by distorted incentives, whether they were fraudulent. Plenty of evidence that there are deeper problems. But what was also clear, that there was no rational basis for the models and for their forecast of what was going to go on. But there's no rational basis for the securitization of what was going on in the securitization model. And some people, I modestly will say, pointed this out well before the crisis. One of the other interesting aspects of the irrationality that was exposed is they wound up constructing these mortgages, first and second mortgages, a set of contracts with service agents that actually made it very difficult to unwind the problems once they occur. So another example I think, an irrationality, underestimating, assuming that the world would go on wonderfully and not taking into account what would happen if things went bad. Derivatives that were growing into huge markets represent another example of irrationality. And I'm using irrationality in a very broad way. And let me just give you a couple examples of aspects of the market that's just very hard to reconcile with any well-functioning market economy, including rational behavior on the market participants. We have a derivatives market, CDS market, of some $300 trillion. That's a lot of money. That is indexed on LIBOR, the London Interbank offer rate. Now, most of you probably understand the London Interbank, the LIBOR rate, to be the rate at which banks borrow from each other. But I hope you understand by now that it is a totally made-up number. But it should have been obvious that it was a made-up number back in 2007, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. How do we know it was a made-up number back in 5, 6 years ago? Because 5 or 6 years ago is when the interbank banks stopped lending to each other because they had such bad portfolios. They knew they didn't know their own balance sheet. They knew that they couldn't know the balance sheet of any other bank. They knew that every other bank, that they were lying, and they knew that every other bank was lying. So that market, the London Interbank, the interbank lending basically stopped. But if there's no lending, what does it mean, the interest rate on London interbank lending? Well, the bankers are very clever. They say it's the rate that we would borrow at if we did borrow, or what they would lend to us if they did lend. Well, that's not quite true, because nobody would lend to them. So it was a totally mythical idea, but it's remained mythical, and it continues. And that's what I find striking. 5 years later, the whole scandal has been exposed, and we're now debating what we should do about this. And one little piece of evidence on this, these are all a little bit more complicated than I've described it, but just one little piece of evidence how we know that something screwy is going on. If you look at we know the number that they report by each bank each day. So we know what they claim they can borrow at. We also know something else about each bank. We know the CDS spreads. We know the risk that the market assigns to each of the banks. Now, you would have thought if the market thinks a bank is about to go bankrupt, the interest rate that it will have to pay should go up a little bit. But there's almost no relationship between the CDS spread and the reported interest rate at which they could borrow. In fact, in some cases, the banks, when they're worried about their financial position, want to tell the market things are really good. So they report that they could borrow at a low interest rate. So the basic point I want to emphasize is we have this huge $300 trillion market based on a number that we don't know what it means. There's another example of what I view as kind of irrationality that I've seen in this market. Was exposed in the Lehman Brothers collapse. Gross positions are much, much larger than net positions. A bets B that something will happen, and then when they decide to change the bet, they don't undo the bet. B bets A. So A is betting B and B is betting A. And usually in our mathematics, we say, you know, one cancels the other. And we look at the net position. And that's true normally. But when doesn't it cancel? It doesn't cancel when A goes bankrupt. Then B owes A, but A doesn't owe B anymore. Depends on where they are in the ability to repay. And if you ask the bankers, I asked them, the bankers, why didn't you net out? They said, well, nobody assumed that anybody was going to go bankrupt. But then I said, but the whole market was betting on other people going bankrupt. I said, well, that was another division. So it was a total kind of schizophrenia as they approached the problem. I've already talked about a little bit about the incentive structures that had incentives to undertake excessive risk, having something to do with corporate governance. But there's a more fundamental problem. The incentive structures that are pervasive in our economy are not closely linked with what people do. Take the CEO incentive structure based on stock price, stock option, very common form. What's a major determinant of the stock price and therefore the rewards of the CEO? A major determinant is what the Fed does about interest rates. If the Fed lowers interest rates, stock prices go up. If the Fed raises interest rates, stock prices go down relatively. Okay? Why should the CEO get higher pay because Greenspan or Bernanke decides to change the interest rate one way or another? It makes absolutely no sense. And I've talked to a lot of CEOs about why are they so, I don't want to use the right word, why do they do this? And you say, you know, you're supposed to be experts in incentives. You know, that you pride yourself, American capitalism, great incentives. Why do you have incentive structures that don't work and that are unrelated to performance when you could design a better one? Well, it's partly irrationality and partly exploitation, the belief that others don't understand them, so if they can get away with it, why not? Well, as I said, there are lots of I have lots of examples of this. Let me just mention just a couple more financial innovations. The financial innovations were supposed to help manage risk. They actually created risk. And as Paul Volcker pointed out, it was hard to identify any increase in the overall economic performance that resulted from these financial innovations. In fact, he said there was nothing of the financial innovations that had coming out of America that had led to an increased economic well-being performance other than the ATM machine. And he got that wrong because the ATM was a UK innovation, not an American innovation. While it's hard to see any increased performance, it's easy to identify large losses in long-term performance that resulted from these financial innovations. In fact, what's so interesting is that financial markets have continually and consistently resisted a whole set of good innovations. When I was chair at the Council of Economic Advisors, I tried to introduce inflation index bonds because I thought it would reduce the risk families face for their retirement long term. And we had enormous resistance from Wall Street. And since Treasury is to a large extent a wholly owned subsidiary of Wall Street, we had a lot of resistance from Treasury. We finally succeeded in overcoming that, and the United States now has TIPS, inflation-protected bonds. Mortgage markets, similarly, there's some interesting mortgage products in Europe. There's something called the Danish mortgage market. A lot of resistance in Europe and the United States to adopting these ideas. Same thing, interesting innovation in Argentina's default, bringing in GDP index bonds as a way of managing that risk. Enormous resistance from Wall Street from that. None of this is a surprise, because whenever there are large discrepancies between social returns and private rewards, markets focus on the private rewards, and therefore they don't focus on those innovations which would maximize social returns. Well, I cannot, well, I've provided, I hope, a broad perspective on what was wrong with the standard model. I want to also highlight some of the limitations on some of the alternative models that have been put forward, like evolutionary theories. Overall, I like those evolutionary theories, I want to say, but I want to give a note of caution. And the problem is that the firms that did not follow the pack, that had not engaged in excessive leverage and other forms, that should be other forms of irrational risk-taking, did not survive. So the notion of evolutionary models is that good firms survive and the bad firms get knocked out. But this crisis has shown that that process is much more erratic, and there are type 1 and type 2 errors, and that one of the things that happened in this crisis is that investors demanded high returns, and those CEOs who said that's imprudent to engage in those got fired. So the market actually made it difficult for those who leaned against the wind, who had alternative models that would have led to, you might say, more biodiversity. They didn't survive. And that's an important word of caution, that we need to take a more active stance in trying to encourage, you might say, biodiversity in our economic ecology. At the same time, firms that have produced good innovations may not have been able to market them. I want to spend just a moment at the end talking about two sets of ideas, one having to do with psychology and one having to do with sociology. I mentioned before that there have been some important advances in behavioral economics based on incorporating insights from psychology and physiology. One that I find particularly interesting and I have done some work on is something called confirmation bias, where there's a tendency to assign more weight to evidence that confirms prior beliefs. If you have a prior belief, you get information, but how you appraise that information that's inconsistent with what your belief, you discard, and information that is consistent with it, you give a lot of weight to. And the interesting thing about this is that it can give rise to equilibrium fictions. So it's sort of like rational expectations. People believe that they are fully rational. In other words, their beliefs are consistent with the information as they process it. But the way they process it is affected by their prior beliefs. And that, of course, means that people with different prior beliefs can both have a set of beliefs that they both believe is consistent with the evidence. And if you think about some of the big political debates, they're very consistent with this. People read the evidence in very different ways. So in many ways, this theory of equilibrium fictions is markedly different than rational expectations, which says that everybody looking at the evidence should come to the same view. This says, no, there will be differences, and those differences can persist. Now, there's other work that's abandoned rational expectations, ideas like animal spirits. The problem with those ideas is they allow anything to happen. You know, you say animal spirits, and you saw that Obama is said to have read the book on animal spirits by Schiller and Alkaloff soon after he became president, and said, well, he was going to announce in the spring of 2009 that green shoots were sprouting all over. And his hope was that by announcing that green shoots were sprouting, the animal spirits would be unleashed in America, and everybody would go out and invest and consume, and the economy would recover, and that would be the end of the Great Recession. Well, as you all know, by June and July, the green shoots had turned brown, and that happened basically every year since then. So while the rational expectation approach is too limiting and too individualistic, the animal spirits approach is too loose. It doesn't constrain what happens, and actually doesn't work very well. So I want to conclude with a remark about some work that I'm doing, developing a theory of societal rigidity and change with Carla Hoff at the World Bank. And that emphasizes that social constructs provide a lens through which people see and interpret reality. So it's not just the confirmatory bias that I talked about before, but sometimes we'll call pre-confirmatory bias. The categories that you use, you know, that whether you see gender, ethnicity, race, caste as relevant depends on the social constructs in which you grow up. That in different societies, they see the world through different lenses. And these lenses are social constructs, and sociologists have long argued on the need to incorporate social constructs into our models of institutions. But what they've not done is try to construct social constructs as equilibrium concepts. What we've been trying to do is think about this process as how do they get formed and evolve. So we think of ideology or a set of higher level beliefs as a state variable in a theory of change and development. Technology, contacts with the outside world, endogenous changes in power and wealth matter not only directly, but through their effect on these underlying beliefs. And this general theory helps explain both societal rigidities and change. They help explain why it may be very difficult to change societies like sometimes, or institutions like sometimes. People have beliefs, particular beliefs, and when evidence comes in that's inconsistent with those beliefs, they discard it. So, to mention a random country like Italy, there are some people in Italy who still believe that austerity is going to work. The evidence is coming in, but their prior belief is so strong that they say it's like the medieval bloodletters. The medieval bloodletters, you let the person's blood, and the guy didn't recover, not surprisingly, but they had a strong model. They had a model that said the bad humors were in the blood. You get rid of the blood with the bad humor, and you would recover. So they let the blood out, and not surprisingly, the guy didn't recover. So what did they say at that point? What Merkel says now, let more blood. Take out more blood, and they continued to do that until the patient died, or a miraculous recovery. And miracles do happen. We call those the tails of the distributions, fat tail distributions. Things do happen, and they recover. And what do they say then? They say, aha, if you do it hard enough, consistently enough, the person will recover. Now, they don't use a statistical model. They think of that one example. And that's what's going on now in Europe today. Those who believe in austerity have not altered their beliefs. They've said, oh, the fact that it hasn't worked, the fact that their forecasts have been consistently wrong, that they have underestimated the downturn, overestimated the improvements in the fiscal basis, has not led them to come to the view that maybe their model is wrong. What have they said is, we need another dose of the same medicine. And that's consistent with this theory of societal rigidity, strong prior beliefs, evidence coming in, they filter it through that particular lens, and it's going to be very difficult for for that change to occur. So, in conclusion, let me just say, I think this is a moment of both reckoning and opportunity. It seems to me that the prevalent economic models encourage policies that contributed to the economic crisis. Some of those models are now contributing to the prolongation of the economic crisis in Europe. I believe that the crisis and what has happened since the crisis has exposed the really very major flaws in these models. These are not minor details. And many of these problems have occurred repeatedly. So this is a real window of opportunity to construct new theories based on more plausible accounts of individual and firm behavior. Thank you.